Shad Marquitz at KE Report believes that we could see some serious implications as a result of the BRICS nation affecting or devaluing the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Now, many believe that the United States has weaponized the dollar, and with different sanctions that we've imposed on countries like Russia, they are looking for ways to group together and lessen the power of the United States. This obviously would have major implications on our U.S. economy. I think you're going to enjoy what Shad has to say. And afterwards, I look forward to your comments. Shad, thanks so much for joining me to discuss your opinions on the collapse of the U.S. dollar. I know it's not a very sexy thing to talk about, and of course, there's been a lot of chatter on social media, YouTube, about the BRICS nation rising up, and I guess just the weaponization in general of the dollar. But just give the viewers a little foundation on why you think the U.S. dollar, what's been the king of the world's reserve currency, just why do you think that we are looking at a potential dollar collapse?
Yeah, it's been called King Dollar for a reason. It has been king, and I think a lot of that ties back to post-World War II, how Henry Kissinger basically lobbied a lot of the oil-producing nations, in particular Saudi Arabia, to use the petrodollar. And so if you wanted to trade oil, you got to trade the dollar. And I think the dollar was also seen as a reserve currency for the world for a reason. We had a strong economy. We still do have the world's strongest economy. But what's happening now is the current landscape, and this has been a process, is that a lot of nations, if you look at something like China, what they're doing, if you look at some of the countries in the Middle East, if you look at the BRICS nations, you're starting to see countries that are looking at how can we become less dependent on this? How can we trade amongst each other with our own currencies? How can we use assets like gold and oil and other hard commodities to trade amongst each other and bypass the petrodollar? And they're openly doing that. And then when you have all these meetings of these BRICS nations discussing potentially coming up with a new currency, I think that's messy because it's hard for them to get along as a big cohesive group. But de-dollarization is a theme that's been going on for really some time in other nations. For us, it sounds like heresy, but I think what that is going to mean is that there will still be a dollar and we will still use it. It'll still be a strong global currency, but it's going to be falling in value. And it's going to be dropping in value just on a technical basis, but also on a fundamental basis in the U.S. as well. And so I think that the dollar collapsing in value, if it just went from where it is now over 100 down into the 80s or 70s, what would that mean for the price of goods? What would that mean for inflation? What would that mean for global trade? And so I think there's a lot of considerations here.
What does it mean when I hear they say weaponization of the dollar? What is that by definition?
Well, I think you're using it like a bludgeoning stick against other nations. Look at what we did with Russia when the Ukraine war started. We immediately went after the SWIFT banking system, which is how banks transfer money amongst each other, and said, you're kicked off at Russia. You can't use the SWIFT banking system anymore. If you're another country looking at that, if you're China, if you're our Saudi Arabia, if you're looking at us as a big trading partner, and you think, wow, you could just kick me out of your banking system collective, maybe I need to start making a plan B. And I think that when other nations saw that, I think that's going to go down as a seminal moment for weaponizing the U.S. dollar against a nation, because if anybody gets off sides with us, that's the same risk they have. And so I think that is a key consideration for why the BRICS nations accelerated their plan. And I think other nations are just thinking, hey, just in case, let's start making some alliances outside of this U.S. dollar situation.
I think Russia, from what I've read on BRICS, they seem to be sort of spearheading it. I know that they have an annual conference, and it's in Russia this year. And I know that there has been talk about a currency, a BRICS currency, to reduce the dependency on these members, these country members, to reduce their dependency on the dollar, just like you said. I just want to kind of lay some foundation for people, because a lot of the audience a lot of people in general are confused as to how dollars are produced. We print them. I know when you look at deficit spending that's happening right now, the debt, climbing $35 trillion or however much, $1 trillion, however many, whatever it is. It's an absurd number. And yet we're trying to get our house in order, our own house in order, as consumer debt is out of control. And it's kind of like, well, if you look at the government and their printing of, and it's not technically printing anymore, the printing presses can't possibly print enough money. It's all digital now, push of a click of a mouse or a keyboard entry. Nixon back in 1971 was an important part of sort of taking away the gold standard, or eliminating what's called the Bretton Woods system. Can you kind of give some history or some foundation of why we eliminated the backing of the paper currency, the fiat currency, eliminated backing it by gold, and so did basically the rest of the world as well, has eliminated any kind of backing on their fiat or paper currency. Some people say, so what? Politicians said, so what? I mean, it's no big deal. We don't need it. What is the significance of not having a gold-backed monetary system?
Yeah, great question. And I think that ties into what the central banks want more than anything, which is to be able to print, or at the click of a mouse, create as much money as they want. When you have a gold-backed monetary system, you have what's called honest money or hard money, and you have something that's backed with a tangible good. And a lot of people today view gold through this bizarro lens in the West of it being a pet rock or a barbarous relic, as it was called. It actually was sound money for a very long period of time, as was silver. But at the time that Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, they unpegged the dollar because France was calling our bluff. They're like, okay, well, let's go ahead. If you can cash in dollars for gold, we'll go ahead and take all the gold out of Fort Knox then. And everybody realized, whoa, let's hit the brakes here. We don't want them to have a call on all the gold. We'll just unpeg it. But what that really does is it gives you the ability with fiat to create as much of it as you want, to paper over any problems you have. If you want to bail out some banks, if you want to bail out some companies like we saw in the great financial crisis, it's a lot easier when it's not backed by gold. Now, I don't know that we'll ever return to a gold standard, but what it also allows us to do, and all nations to do, is basically inflate your way out of problems. And that's what central banks love to do. And that's what governments like to do with fiscal spending. And so what it basically allows you to do is to devalue your currencies. All fiat currencies are in agreement now. They're in agreement that there's a value to this because they're a piece of paper with a dead president on it. There's no value to the paper. It's just something that we agree has value as a trading mechanism. But when there's nothing backing it, and the BRICS nations are actually talking about backing their currency with commodities, maybe a mix of commodities, maybe gold. I don't know that we'll ever go back to a gold standard, but what it really basically did is it allowed governments in the world and central banks to print as much currency as they want, which is why we've seen all fiat currencies dropping in value in their purchasing ability. And it's not, people look at the dollar and say, oh, it's still a dollar. Okay, but your dollar is buying less today. How much more today is gas than it was 10, 20 years ago? How much more is milk and groceries and eggs than they were? That is because your fiat currency is dropping. So why it matters to people in their everyday life is everything is going up in prices. You've got inflation going up because you've got fiat going down. And when you've got fiat going down globally, they're measured against each other, it doesn't look so bad. But when you look at what you can actually purchase with those dollars, that's why this is so significant.
Well, when sort of along with what you're saying, when Nixon took us off the gold standard, wasn't it one of the primary reasons? Wasn't it because of inflation?
Exactly, but they realized that they can regulate it, throttle it up and throttle it down using central banks easier. But it was really also because the people were calling their bluff. They were saying, hey, if your dollar is the greenback, if it's backed by gold, we'll take the gold instead of your dollars for trade. And it was really France that was pushing the envelope the most. But then other nations said, hey, good idea, France. Let's go ahead and cash in our dollars for gold. That's something they absolutely didn't want. And so when they unpegged it, I think they have gold at $35. Well, as we talked about in our live show on Tuesday night a couple weeks back, look what happened to gold since then. It went from $35 to several $100s to hundreds of dollars to $1,000 to now $2,300. Well, what does that say about what your dollar's worth? If that dollar would buy if that dollar to gold was $35 and now it's $2,300 to a dollar, what does that say about how far your dollar has fallen since 1971?
Why not just print enough dollars to eliminate the deficit.
That is the source of inflation. People debate all the time, where is inflation coming from? It's not because of supply deficits. That's an accelerant on consumer prices. It's not because of trade imbalances. The source of inflation is always the creation of more money supply. And look at our deficit right now. We're at the point with these higher interest rates. Now that the Fed has cranked up the tightening process over the last couple of years, we've got all this government debt. Every year, it seems like we have 2 or 3 debt ceiling debates, and it's political theater where, are we going to raise it or are we not? Every time they've raised it. It's like a kid with a credit card that keeps jumping up the balance higher and higher and higher until they can't afford it anymore. So now we're a nation that can't afford the debt. We're drowning in debt. And our way to get out of it is to try to inflate our way out of it. The only other option is deflation and a deflationary spiral, which they absolutely are panicked about. That's probably on the board as well. But if you try to inflate your way out and just create as much dollars, other nations say, well, then I don't want to trade in your dollars. You're not going to be the world's reserve currency if you do that. And so that is the source of inflation. And there's no way we can pay back the debt. So it's to the point now where we're really at a tipping point. Do we have some kind of a debt jubilee? Do we have some kind of a thing where we try to all as nations forgive it? Because every other nation did the exact same thing we did. They're also inflating their way out of the problem. The Eurozone's doing the same thing. Look at Japan, the mess they've been for 2 decades. Look at what China's doing right now. They're trying to print their way out of the real estate bubble they've created over there, and they're trying to paper over the fact that they've got a real estate crisis. Every time you do that, you're driving the value down. It's just that it's a race to the bottom. All of the currencies are dropping at the same time because we're all using the same playbook. So if we actually tried to pay off our debt now, it would be suicide.
Well, when we talk about inflation and the amount of debt and continued deficit spending, wouldn't one think that the best hedge would be to invest in physical assets like real estate, where if inflation takes place, the price of the real estate increases?
Absolutely. Hard assets, real things, tangible things in a country and really a marketplace that's obsessed with digital items, service companies and advertising companies and AI and digital. It's really hard assets you want to be in the time. Look at what just happened in 2022 when we had the Ukraine war start. What shot up crazier than anything? Oil. Oil is a hard asset. Energy is a great place to be to beat inflation, because guess what goes up every time there's inflation? The cost of gas, the cost of oil, the cost of energy. So real estate, energy, gold, silver, hard assets, land, farmland, agricultural land, water rights, anything that's tangible and real is going to retain its value in an inflationary environment. So if you can get your hands on real assets, that's the way to weather the storm.
What about the fact that we may see a massive real estate price correction?
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag here in that you can see real estate prices come down hard, and I think that they probably will because of the effect of higher interest rates, the higher for longer rates, the fact that it's drying up new home buyers. New home buyers can't afford to get into the market. It's stretched so prices have already stretched so far from the go-go years now that they're going to have to correct. But on the long haul, you'll still over time do well in real estate, and it may change. Farmland's a little bit different than buying multifamily units downtown, and that's different than buying a residential unit. So different kinds of real estate, as you well know. But I think things like land and using it for farming and something that can be done with land, or some kind of a use for the land that inflates up with everything else, that's a great use for it. I still think commodities are a great place to be. And even things like having access to water rights. Wealthy people, what are they doing? What are billionaires doing? They're buying up water. They're buying up farmland, they're buying up commodities, and they're buying up whole blocks of real estate. So that's what the wealthy are doing because they see the writing on the wall.
I want to give some definition to the BRICS for those that may not know, and I pulled this off of Wikipedia. I want to come down a couple paragraphs. It says, combined, the BRICS members encompass about 30% of the world's land surface, 45% of the global population. Brazil, Russia, India, and China are among the world's 10 largest countries by population, area, and gross domestic product nominal, and by purchasing power parity. It also says the term BRIC was originally developed in the context of foreign investment strategies. It was introduced in the 2001 publication, Building Better Global Economic, BRICS, by then chairman of the Goldman Sachs Asset Management, Jim O'Neill. Goes on to say the foreign ministers of the initial 4 BRIC general states, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, met in New York City in September of 2006 at the margins of the general debate of the UN Assembly, beginning a series of high-level meetings. Is Wall Street involved in the BRICS?
Well, I'm sure there are aspects of Wall Street that are counting on this and playing into this. Goldman Sachs always shows up in these kind of things. But I think it was initially a way of trying to do a trading block, like they're saying here. Initially, how do we trade with these countries that are emerging with big populations? What it's turned into over the last 20 years plus is a group of nations that are looking at not trading with us. So it went from how do we capitalize on trading to these giant foreign developing emerging nations to, hey, why do these emerging nations want to trade with each other, not us? So it's creating new trade alliances. And you can see that they also added in a lot of new members just over the last year. I think that's also significant. And there's also other nations on the waiting list to join. So it's not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as it was initially. There's now multiple countries saying, hey, count us into this mix as well. And I think that's important to note.
Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. It also says that there was a 2010 expansion, and then there was a new development bank in June of 2012. Says the BRICS nations pledged $75 billion to boost the lending power of the International Monetary Fund, known as the IMF. And then here, just like you said, in 2024, this year, there was an expansion developing from the August 2023 15th BRICS Summit. South Africa's president announced that 6 emerging market group countries, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, had been invited to join the bloc. Full membership was scheduled to take effect in January of this year. However, Argentina had withdrawn their application. But, you know, and before, and just kind of to segue into that, I found this NASDAQ.com write-up in May 9th of 2024, and it covers why do the BRICS nations want to create a new currency. And I think this is one of the things, Shad, that is really starting to rumble through social media like YouTube. As I said earlier, a lot of people, at least mainstream media, don't want to give a lot of credit to this potential of this BRICS currency for obvious reasons, right? But here NASDAQ.com says the BRICS nations have a slew of reasons for wanting to set up a new currency. Recent global financial challenges and aggressive U.S. foreign policies have prompted the BRICS countries to explore the possibility they want to better serve their own economic interest while reducing global dependence on the U.S. dollar and the euro. It says, when will the BRICS currency be released? There's no definitive launch date as of yet, but the country's leaders have discussed the possibility at length. During the 14th BRICS summit held in mid-2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin said the BRICS countries plan to issue a new global currency and are ready to work openly with all fair partners. And then last year, in the lead up to the 2023 BRICS summit in August, there was speculation that there would be an announcement that currency could be on the table, but it didn't happen at that meeting. What are your thoughts? I mean, do you think this is? Do you think it's going to happen?
Well, so this is interesting. We've been talking about this on our show at the KE Report for years now, and it was considered a tinfoil hat idea a couple of years ago. People scoffed at it and said, oh, that'll never happen. What happened in 2022 and 2023 at their meetings showed the world that it absolutely is happening. When you have giant countries like Russia and China and India saying, and I think India is maybe actually of all of them less interested in being part of it. They've actually said that. But most of the countries that there's a waiting list to join. Not only did they add 6 new countries, but there's about 20 countries on a waiting list to get into the BRICS. So when you see that kind of interest and when they're openly stating that they want to come up with a new global reserve currency, it's going to be a process, not an event. They're not going to come out and say, ta-da, here it is. Everybody ditch your dollar and go into this new brick. Also, there's going to be issues to them. How are they going to weave these patchwork quilt of different nations together into a cohesive unit? I think there's going to be challenges. Look at how hard it is for Europe to act as a single entity. How are all these disparate nations going to be able to do the same thing? But it's happening. It's in process. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's something that's actually they're announcing to the world that they are doing. So we talk about it a lot on our show because we're a commodity show. And obviously, when that announcement came out, guess what spiked? Gold. Guess what spiked? Oil. A lot of things spiked when they came out with that announcement. Now, it ended up being a nothing burger at that meeting because they didn't announce the currency. But they've been pointing out over and over again that they are working towards that. So I think this is something that plays out over a decade or two, not in a year. But I think it's something that gradually erodes the confidence in the dollar. And everybody thought it was going to be China. They thought it was going to be the yuan. China's saying we'd rather have a collective currency that represents all of these emerging nations and their power collectively together. You pointed out some of the stats there. Look how much land mass they have. Look how much population they have. Look how many resources they have. Look at what a huge trading block that is. And China's had the Silk Road initiative for a long time where they wanted to tie together a bunch of trading partners like they had in ancient times, the Silk Road, and create a modern day version of that. That is the BRICS. That's exactly what they're doing. So I think people should scoff less and consider it more. It's not imminent, but it's happening. And I think it's significant. And I think in the history books, hundreds of years from now, this is going to go down as the moment where, like the fall of the Roman Empire, this is the fall of the U.S. empire and the rise of a new empire. And it's not a one nation story. It's a multi-nation story.
What do you think that the U.S. will do to slow this down? I mean,
Everything
obviously,
it can.
yeah. I mean, there's something further down in the article. It says, how would the BRICS currency impact the economy? It says a potential shift toward a new BRICS currency could have significant implications for the North American economy and investors operating within it. Some of the most effective sectors and industries include oil and gas, which is critical, banking and finance, commodities, international trade, technology, tourism and travel, the foreign exchange market. I mean, what type of impact do you think we'd see? What would happen to Wall Street?
Yeah, I mean, I think that list there is very significant. The oil and gas, banking and financing, commodities. I mean, that's the world I live in every day. International trade. What could be more significant than that as far as how nations trade? Do nations start saying, hey, if you want to trade with us, you've got to use the BRIC currency? It was fair game when the U.S. said, hey, if you want to trade oil, you got to use the petrodollar. Turnaround's fair play. Now they say, hey, if you want to trade with us, you got to use the BRICS dollar. What if they start that kind of a mindset? How would that affect global trade? It's huge. I mean, that's a big deal. Also, look at where most of the chips are made currently. They're made in Asia. Look at where most of the commodities are refined. They're in Asia, mostly in China, but you're also looking at countries like Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, that are also powerhouses and Taiwan's the chip capital. So when you start looking at how this could start affecting nations that are right there in that vicinity, they're going to want to be part of the BRICS nations too. They're going to want to trade. And that's going to change how do you get electronics here? How do you build cars here? People forget that these components are shipped from overseas. You may assemble the parts here, but a lot of these parts are sourced from overseas. If you've got to start playing with BRICS nations in their currency, that's a game changer. And I do think it absolutely spikes the punch bowl for commodities. And that's why we're so laser focused on it every day, because it's going to change the way all of the raw resources are traded on the global stage. And I think that's very significant.
You had said that a lot of this is coming as a result of a backfire against the U.S. And, because of our policies, because of European policies and sanctions. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, what happened during, the Ukraine war with Russia. What other types of policies and sanctions are or have happened that sort of, this has been in the works for quite some time. I mean, we're talking about more than 20 years the BRICS have been working on this. I mean, what other things have we what have we done to piss these countries off?
Yeah, I mean, look at Iran's on the list. We've been sanctioning Iran for 2 decades, and maybe rightly so. But if you are the people living in Iran, you're like, hey, then fine, we'll trade with somebody else. We just did it to China very recently. The Biden administration just put sanctions on China. That's not making them too happy right now. And there's this whole tech battle going on with China, but they're also sanctioning goods. Okay, well then, if you're these countries and you continue, and we have military bases all over the planet, we are trying to be the world police, which is maybe a project too big. It's bankrupt every country that's ever tried it throughout human history. When you try to police the world, when you try to manage the whole world, you can't do it. And the United States has been doing that for decades now. And it's not just one administration or the other. It's been administration after administration. And so if we keep poking look how many proxy wars we've started just since the 70s all the way forward. There's something like 30 or 40 proxy wars that we're in over that time frame. All those countries are looking at this saying, we need a way to get out of the dollar as a reserve currency. But there's not an easy way to do it. Which other currency would you turn to right now? The euro? I don't think so. Would you turn to the yen? It's a basket case. Would you turn to the yuan? Not yet. So the BRICS nations' idea is like, we're not going to be able to do this just one country, but we could do it together, the strength in numbers idea. And there's been a history of a lot of these countries. Look at what we've done with Venezuela. There's so many countries that we have sanctioned or pressed our trade authority and thrown our weight around. And some of them are sick of it. It's like a schoolyard bully. Eventually, people gang up on the schoolyard bully. And I love America. I love the United States. But I just think it's a result of poor policy on foreign policy and trade policy. And this is the result you get. People want a alternative, and they're coming up with their own. And their actions of the last couple of years have only accelerated it.
What do you think some of the repercussions would be leading up to a dollar collapse?
Yeah, again, I don't know that it's going to just crash. Like some people come out there and it's a little hyperbolic and it makes for good headlines like dollar crash. And it is crashing in value. But I don't think it's ever going to go away. Like we're still using the British pound. The British pound is still a world currency. We still have the Swiss franc. We still have all these currencies. We're still using the euro. The reality is we'll just become less important. I think our future looks a lot like Great Britain's of the past. Like we were the colonial superpower, and over time, still a powerful nation, still a nation of respect, still a huge economy. You can't take that away from the United States. But if your currency is not important on the global stage to the degree that it was before, right now we're the only game in town. If there's multiple games in town, it's dilution of the importance of the global currency. And I think as more countries redeem dollars for hard assets and call right now we're giving out trade IOUs like, hey, we'll get you back. Eventually people are going to say, I'm going to cash that IOU in now. Go ahead and take your treasuries back. So I think it's going to affect the treasury and bond market in a big way. Go ahead and take your treasuries back. Go ahead and take your dollars back. We're going to go ahead and use a different currency as our carry currency, and we're going to go ahead and trade amongst each other. As those dollars get redeemed, as they come back home and repatriate, the dollars are going to drop. What it means is a lessening of the daily a lessening of daily life for middle income Americans because everything is going to cost more. What we're going to have is a much longer period of inflation. People have been making a big to-do about the recent inflation, and it's very significant what we've seen. Well, how about a decade or two of rising inflation? What if we see stickier inflation for a long period of time and people's way of life for their children and grandchildren isn't like it was in the past? I don't think most people really believe that. I don't think most people believe that's going to happen. I think there's a ton of skepticism. But if we wait 10 years and 20 years and get back together, Todd, God help us, and say, okay, well, look at where it is now. We told you. That's not going to do anybody any favors. What people need to be doing now is planning ahead proactively for this process to unfold. It's not imminent, but it's a process that's happening, and it's going to keep happening. And there's ways to protect yourself. There's ways to, like we say, get into the different various forms of hard assets to diversify your own asset base, knowing that this is coming. But I think for most people, it's going to be a rude awakening. If you're complaining about how much it is at the grocery store or restaurant now, think about what it'll be like in a decade when the dollar's worth less and less.
Well, you say it's not imminent, but giving a description like that it's coming, I mean, it sounds pretty imminent to me. You can't, I mean, there's two options. One is to inflate this debt away. The other would be to, create more debt, which would just kick the can down the road. What do you think the biggest threat to the U.S. economy is right now?
Yeah, probably ourselves for just those exact same reasons. I think the biggest threat to the U.S. economy is U.S. policymakers and the central bank. I think that, and what I mean by that is, look at the response we just saw to the COVID lockdown period, where we issued all kinds of funny money to people, helicopter money. I would almost say cargo plane money, because we were giving out stimmy checks, and people were using those checks. Some were using it to stay afloat if they lost their job, but a lot of people were using it to speculate. That's what drove the meme stock craze. That's what drove all the speculation in the markets. All that money went into speculation, and then the payment protection plan, the PPP. Look how much of that money was misused. Look at the fraud there. Well, it also set a precedent that we'll do it again. And so what'll happen is whoever wins this election and future administrations, they're going to use the exact same playbook they always have. Let's give away more money. Let's spend more money. Let's bail out more companies. Let's bail out the airlines if they're failing. Let's bail out the banks if they're failing. Let's look at all the credit repo facilities that the Fed has created, and look at all of the that slush fund, that bank funding term protection program that they came up with to get rid of illiquid banks when there was the regional banking crisis. We're going to do more of that, and that's exactly what causes inflation. All those fiscal spending backed by monetary policy with the Fed, all of that. Let's go ahead and print away our problems means a worse. It's a tax on everybody. That's what it is. It's a tax, and it's the silent force of inflation that everybody deals with in their daily life. And then they have the audacity to get on TV and say, we don't really understand where inflation's coming from. We think it's supply chain, or we think it's global trade. It's like, you're the ones creating the inflation. The Fed is the one doing it, and so are the policymakers. And the answer is really austerity and to cut spending and to live within and to balance the budget. That's not going to happen in our lifetimes. What they're going to do is spend more, print more, and it's going to just accelerate the decline of the dollar in tandem with all these other countries saying, hey, I don't think I want as many dollars as we held in the past.
Well, I think it's as someone who has dealt with the government for pretty much my entire career, regulations, being in the construction business and just going through the permitting process, going to Baltimore City or the county and seeing how agonizing it is to go to a counter and watch these people do their jobs. And I'm not. Look, I mean, I know you get it in every in every workplace. You have complacency or laziness that's in the workplace. But one thing I notice about government workers is they're not scared to whether they lose their jobs or not. I mean, their jobs are pretty secure no matter how proficient they are at running their business. And this is growing. This government, employment is becoming bigger. We're the exact opposite of what was intended to have a small government, governing our body, the people. And this government is getting so big and so powerful with so much spending. They're the largest employer out there in the United States. And we don't really make anything. We don't do anything. I mean, we may manufacture things for the DOD, but I mean, we're buying our parts from, overseas. So do you think that's a threat to ourselves? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the globalization movement and the just-in-time delivery caused us to outsource most of the manufacturing and also cheaper labor in other areas. So even international conglomerates that are based here build everything somewhere else. And so what's happened after decades of that is a dependence on this foreign network that may be turning their back on us. So we've almost in a way dug our own graves. And as you say, we don't make anything. All that deficit that we have is a result of too much spending, too much giveaways, too much bailing out, too much interference in the process. If we had a truly free market, the market would figure out what was the fair price. What's the fair price for labor? When you start saying, okay, we got to have a minimum wage now that's $15 or maybe $20, or if you're California, 25 or whatever, there's a point where you're interfering in the natural free market. And we've interfered so much at this point that we're dependent on a central bank that shouldn't exist. People forget the first 150 years of this country, we didn't have a central bank. We didn't need one. And most of the founding fathers would have cringed if they would have seen what we've done with the banking system, because it's basically a monster. There's a great book out that I'd recommend for people called The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Oh, I read
it. And it talks about where how this monster was created, the central bank. But this has happened in all countries. They're all using central banks. They're all doing the same playbook. So it's not unique to the United States. The problem is, and we don't even have as much debt to GDP ratio as some other countries. China is far worse. But it's a big enough problem for us as the leader of the world economy, as the number one nation of growth. that we don't make anything anymore. We have a manufacturing sector that's there. There's things we make, so I shouldn't say we don't make anything, but it's tiny in comparison to the way it used to be. And so there's the idea of onshoring and bringing things back, but I don't know that we'll get there. And every administration points finger at the next one and says, "Look how much money that last guy spent," or look how much money the last administration spent. And then they go and they spend more every single time. You can look at hockey stick charts that show how much money has been created over the last just couple decades, and from administration to administration, they always spend more. I remember Obama picking on the Bushes for how much they spent. I remember Bushes picking on Clinton for how much he spent. I remember that when Trump came in, he was going to. Everybody has spent more money than the last administration, so it doesn't matter who wins. They're going to spend more money. That'll be backstopped by the central bank that then prints more money, and what that means is your fiat currency is going to drive down in value, and what that means is everyday goods cost more, and the only way to get around that is to have something that inflates at the same pace of it. Or the idea has been floated out there that there could be all these countries that say, let's do a debt jubilee. In ancient times, that's actually what they did. They would forgive the debts and say, let's just have a restart. And so a lot of the people think the WEF and the World Economic Forum that they may be building towards this big debt jubilee, and it may involve digital currencies. Hey, if we switch everything over from fiat currencies to the new crypto world of digital currencies, only this is not going to be your friendly Bitcoin or Dogecoin or Ethereum. This is going to be central bank digital currencies. If they start doing that, they could start doing things like, okay, we're going to give you a stimulus on your digital currency, but you have to spend it by September. And if you don't, it goes to zero. If you say something that runs afoul of the government, we may just go ahead and turn off your digital currency. It creates a brave new world, one that I don't think we're going to like. And a lot of people are sleepwalking right into it.
You mentioned a debt jubilee. Do you think that that would be possible that they would do that with bonds?
I think it's a little different. I mean, obviously, the treasuries are how countries raise money, and I think that there's some serious problems under the surface with the bond market. We had a 40-year bond bubble. That bubble popped in 2020. That's when rates got down to the 0.4%, the lowest they'd ever been. Now we're at 4% plus rates, and I think that the rates, if you can think back to the 70s and 80s when they were in double digits, I don't think that that's that far out of the question again. Do people want to go back to that stagflationary environment where we have super high interest rates, high energy prices, possibly paired with unemployment ratcheting higher and a job market that goes down the toilet? I don't think that that's that far out of the realm of potential over the next couple of years if we look at what's coming. But I think the bond market is toast. I think that over time, there'll be ups and downs, but I think the bonds are going to fall in value because, again, who's going to buy these bonds? Every time we have to put bonds up for auction, we're trying to pay for the swollen government you just talked about, where the people feel that they have job security. Most of that GDP growth we've been seeing is from the government sector. Most of those jobs numbers that are kind of cooked a little bit are because of the government sector. And so that's only going to swell larger and larger. What you would need to do is come in with a scalpel or maybe a chainsaw and say, hey, let's cut out all this spending. Let's get rid of most of these government organizations. Who is going to do that on their watch? What politician is going to have the cojones to come in and say, okay, we're cutting? I mean, you know who just did is Argentina. And look at how amazing it was, how quickly they turned around their economy, how quickly they turned around their spending. But you have to have somebody that comes in that's that kind of off the cuff and just says, we're slicing, we're dicing, and I don't care what anybody says. You elected us. Here's what we're going to do. I don't see anybody in the United States pulling that off anytime soon.
You had said that we make some things. I said we don't make anything. And I tried to find some stats on what do we make and what percentage of what we use in our daily lives, what percentage of that is actually made domestically. It was almost impossible to find any information on this, as is anything that you want to look up to challenge or research the truth. The latest data that I could find was in 2015. I mean, I didn't just do a brief search, okay? I dove into it. I probably spent more than an hour of, scouring through publications. What I could find was so skewed that it basically showed the percentage of money, like what we spent or what we spend annually on domestic manufactured products. I couldn't see the actual percentage of what, like, if clothes, for instance, and we know that's a large percentage of imported, product, right? But it wouldn't say, like 10% of the clothes in the United States are manufactured in the United States. What it said was this amount of money was spent on clothing from domestic manufacturing. Well, of course, things cost more money here to manufacture, so that's not a very good metric. I'm trying to find out, like, what are the percentages we experienced through the shutdown, just how vulnerable we are to imported products from other countries. We saw our brands that we buy typically in the stores disappear, and all of a sudden these weird name products were on the shelves, and the shelves were very empty. I mean, I personally had my truck at the dealer for 4 months because I was missing a part. You couldn't drive it. This isn't an overnight fix. So I think as we're coming more and more into the reality that we are screwed when we don't play well with others.
Well, and on the manufacturing front, think about cars. We do build cars here, but a lot of the components are shipped overseas. And we build them here, but they're not 100% made here. So to your point, during the lockdowns, look how many people couldn't buy a car because they couldn't get the maybe it just needed the navigation system or an electronic component in it. And so you couldn't build the whole car. We could build most of a car, but it won't run. Well, that doesn't help me. Same thing with boats. We build a lot of boats here. I used to actually, in a previous life, I was in an insurance business, and I called on a lot of companies and manufacturers. We do build certain things, medical supply parts, but a lot of the metals that were used were sourced from overseas. So if you can't trade overseas to get the metal, you can't make the scalpel. You can't make the medical procedure part. And I used to live in Tennessee, and by Tennessee, there's Dalton, Georgia. They have a lot of carpeting, but some of that is sourced. Some of the raw materials are sourced. Like, even though they make the carpeting there, they're sourcing it from other places. North Carolina is a big hub for furniture. There's a lot, yeah, but some of the wood is shipped overseas that makes the furniture. So you can see how important it is to have a global supply chain. And there's very few things that we 100% make here. We assemble things here. It's kind of like a giant IKEA store. Like, we're making things here, but it's coming from somewhere else. And so even in a lot of our trade partners in Europe or Mexico or Canada, we're still sourcing things from other places. We're not an island that can be dependent on its own. We need to have trading partners. The whole world does. We all have different things that help the other countries. But if the global trade environment is changing, are we going to be left at the table with our hand out saying, hey, we want some of those parts too? So that's the big push for chips. That's why there's an AI craze. Again, 90% of the chips historically have been made in Taiwan. Well, if China takes over Taiwan, there goes all your chips. What are you going to do then? So you have to start onshoring and building more on-site manufacturing. And there's a big push. All these data centers, we're going to make that. I don't know that it's tangible, but we're sure going to have a lot of data centers for AI. We've got a lot of service companies. We have survived on the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons. We've survived on tech businesses that are not really tangible. And again, Amazon's not going to be selling anything if they can't source it from somewhere else. So it's very complicated. It's a very nuanced situation. But I think it was really, the last couple of years have been eye-opening for a lot of businesses when they realize, hey, my just-in-time turned into, hey, it may be a 2-year wait. And then that changes your customer base. And that changes how we all shop and how we all live, and it affects your daily life. So I think these are big topics that are happening right now. And I think there's going to be huge changes that we live through just in the next decade.
Well, tech jobs are about to get decimated from AI. And I mean, you can see, we are a big tech hub, and a large amount of our jobs are from the tech industry. And we've seen tens of thousands of layoffs already this year alone. And last year we had tons of layoffs in tech as well. I think white collar workers in general should be concerned that their jobs are being eliminated and consolidated and replaced by robotics and AI. Question for you. Would you consider yourself conspiratorial?
Not really. I don't like the word conspiracy theories, because I think it's too convenient to poke fun at somebody and say, and then dismiss the whole idea. I believe in coincidence theory. Isn't it a coincidence that the people that are involved in these banking things also are the ones that are pretending they don't know where inflation comes from? Isn't it a coincidence that our policymakers do these terrible foreign policy campaigns, and then they point the finger at the other people and say, look at these countries, they're all problems. It's like, wait a minute, you were the one poking the hornet's nest. You're the one that created some of these problems, and then you immediately blame shift away. So I think it's a coincidence that these problems are always tied to some of these deep state actors. But I do think people take it a little far. I just think it's easy to dismiss something like the BRICS and just say, it'll never happen. But then when it happens, those people never come back and say, hey, I guess you're right. I guess it did happen. I remember people saying a couple of years ago that that oil is going away. We're not going to be driving internal combustion engines. Everything's going to be EVs. Here's the plan. And it didn't happen. It's not even close to happening the way that they said it would. But if you believed people in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we wouldn't even be driving cars today. There's so many projections people make, and they act like, hey, scientists back this up, and it's a fact. But the reality is, it's always a moving target. And so I think people should keep their minds open to what are the potential strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, the SWOT analysis. What is happening on the national stage? What's happening in my local community? What's happening in my business? How can I address this? And if something seems too far-fetched, okay, research it, look into it. What's the probability of it happening? If it's a low probability, dismiss it. But some of these things are high probability. They're happening and they're hiding in plain sight. And there's people going to conferences on jet airplanes in Switzerland every year talking about these ideas in the journalisms are covering it, but people think, oh, well, that's just a conspiracy. Well, go ahead and read the articles, read what they're saying. I watch some of the things, and I'm just amazed that this is what we're discussing doing in the future. Cybersecurity, defense. We're going to have drones going in. It's not just that you're going to lose your job because of AI, it's automation. Look at all the fast food jobs that demanded $15 an hour, and now they've been replaced with automated menus when you walk in. That's not AI. I mean, it's tech, but tech is replacing jobs and the policymakers, we got to get these people that salt French fries. They get paid $15 an hour. This is important. Well, they need a living wage. Well, now they're living without the wage because there's automation. So that's only going to escalate. And so that's also setting them up for exactly what they want: universal basic income, living off the government teat, having an allowance like a child. And that's what they're setting it up for. If everybody's losing their jobs because of automation and AI, not everybody, but if a lot of sectors do, there's more and more people that are now at the mercy of government handouts and government programs, which only swell those government programs from a safety net to a 50% of the people is now utilizing the safety net. And that's not a net anymore. That's a way of life. And now, guess what? More spending, more fiscal spending, which means more inflation. It is exactly what they want.
You had mentioned the book on Jekyll Island. And for those that haven't heard of the book or don't know what it's about this secret duck hunting trip that 6 individuals went to Jekyll Island for this duck hunting excursion. And it just so happened, and this was in 1911, and it just so happened that 4 of the 6 of the people that were there were directly connected with J.P. Morgan. And
isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah, right. So talk about, and today, I mean, what businesses, if we look back 100 years, there aren't a whole lot of businesses in their industry that still exist today. And, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 or announced or signed into, existence in 1913, 2 years after it was written by these 6 individuals. But Jamie Dimon is still prominent in the global space today with a company, JP Morgan Chase, that 4 of those members of the 6 members were members of JP Morgan Chase. So when you look at that, and I could be, maybe I'm wrong on my numbers or whatever, it was a while ago since I read the book, but my point is, and why I asked if you were conspiratorial, is because there's a lot of talk that there is some kind of an ultimate plan. And I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that. You had mentioned the World Economic Forum, or WEF. You mentioned the United Nations. We've talked about the BRICS. But there's also BIS, who is said to be running all of the banks that are in existence globally. I don't know. I mean, this is all new to me. I'm a real estate broker, man. I'm just trying to figure this out like many of our listeners. But what do you think about that? Do you think it's possible that there is this ultimate plan?
I think that it makes for enticing stories to say that there's one cabal that's going to rule the roost. I don't know that human beings are that organized, but there's definitely clubs. I look at it very practically. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I want to make it clear. I just look at it from an economic standpoint. Who is pulling the strings? The people with power. If you look back at the old steel magnates and oil magnates and automaker magnates of the past, they did the same thing. How can Carnegie, push his weight around here? How can Rockefeller push his weight around here? These banking entities and the Jamie Dimons of the world, they're doing the exact same thing. Hedge funds are doing the same thing. Power brokers, banks, they're doing the same thing. A lot of these politicians and media people that are their mouthpieces and a lot of the big business people are in clubs. Is it that weird of an idea that these rich people get together and make plans for the future? Plans that they don't really care as much about you. They care about them. They care about their empires. They care about their legacy. It's not that crazy of an idea that these people meet in the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. These are real groups. Almost every president is picked from these groups. There's pictures of, you can go see them online. There's pictures of Reagan and Nixon sitting together before Reagan was even elected. There's pictures of these groups where there's politicians, media people, business people, banking people, all hanging out in these clubs. So I look at it as something that's gone on for all of human history. Powerful people and the elites always come up with plans that serve them. And they don't help necessarily the masses. They manage the masses. I don't think that's any different now. Is it just one group that's trying to control everything with a big plan? I don't think it's that organized. But I do think that there's agendas. Remember that the WEF is an outgrowth of Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2030. People think, well, are we not seeing big environmental? Because the whole point of the Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2030 was by those time periods, by 2020 and 2030, we'd have certain Green New Deal initiatives. Are those not being floated? Are we not seeing carbon taxes? Are we not seeing carbon credits as a business idea? Are we not seeing a push for EVs? Are we not seeing a push to put smart meters in all of your homes and manage how much electricity you're using, how much water? What if they start telling you, hey, Todd, you can only have this much water this month. And if you use any more, you got a huge surcharge or you just can't have it. What if they start telling people listening to this call, this is your electricity quota and you have to offset your carbon footprint because we believe in these climate change initiatives? Well, all of that is part of a plan. It's not just one person or one group, but there's definitely a plan. And so if you look at the World Economic Forum, some of the ideas they have is micro-housing. Well, what are we seeing? We're seeing commercial real estate, like we talked about last time, turned into micro-housing. Sometimes it doesn't end so pretty, but those are the initiatives. There's also going to be areas of the country where they tell you, hey, you just can't go there anymore because of the environment. We're protecting it. Well, when your smart car won't take you there anymore, when your internal combustion engine could, that's a form of control. So I look at it as there's a form of control that's being layered on society. And it's because there are narratives and initiatives that they then turn into policy. That policy then turns into the law, and that law then affects your daily life. And so from that sense, there's no conspiracy about it. It's very real. How does the world look now compared to how it did 20 years ago? Very different. If they just floated the idea out that we can lock down a whole culture and a whole planet because of a viral outbreak, what's to say that they don't do that again because of a climate outbreak or because of another virus? What is the response going to be next time? And I was amazed at how quickly most people rolled over and said, hey, what are you going to do? They're in power. So I think that from that standpoint, it's not a conspiracy. These are things that actually happen. And I think some people in these organizations believe they're managing the human population threat, the climate threat, the threat to business in a way that makes sense to them, but it's usually divorced of how it affects everyday people. And I'm fighting for the little guy. I'm fighting for everyday people to have better quality of life. And I'm also just looking at what ways can we protect ourselves financially and insulate ourselves from some of these changes so that we have better quality of life.
Yeah, we're going to control people so that we can have frogs, more frogs. I mean, it's crazy. Well, I mean, obviously, Shad, we could talk for hours and hours on end, but tell everybody, what's the best way that they can follow you? I mean, I know, we haven't even really talked about what you do. You have an amazing YouTube channel. We have in the show notes below all the links to your website, your podcast. But what can you offer people as sort of like an alternative to, how do they protect their assets, their money? Because a lot of people have money in the bank. And oh, by the way, banks are really getting aggressive now. trying to convince you to put your money in, high-paying money markets, high-yielding money markets of more than 4% with no penalties. They limit how many checks you can write and stuff like that because banks need money right now. So it is interesting to see, how they're trying to convince people to inject their cash in their bank, but it may not be of the best interest. I'm not saying don't keep cash, and I don't think that you're saying that either. But how can people learn more about what you do, and give us some tips on how to protect your cash?
Sure. And first thing I would say is I'm a big believer in diversification. I don't believe in putting all your eggs in one basket. So when you mentioned earlier, spreading it around into real estate, maybe you should have a portion of it making 5% in a money market. It's not a bad idea for money to just sitting there dormant. You might as well make 5% on it while you can. And if interest rates go higher and it goes to 6, 7, 8, which historically has happened many times, not a bad place to park some money. What we do on our show, though, it's the KE report. You can find us on the show notes. And I also do a Substack article where I'm talking about the commodities complex. And really what we're looking at is an alternative to not just the fiat currency. That's really more of a gold narrative. But with commodities, things like silver, copper. Like if you're going to build a bunch of charging stations, if you're going to build EV stations and AI data centers and cryptocurrency mining centers, you're going to need a lot more copper. Where's it going to come from? I think what a lot of people fail to realize and what we really focus on is if it's not grown, it's mined. If you look, the computer and the microphones that we're talking on right now were mined. Like these components came out of the ground. They weren't just, you don't just grow a computer. You don't grow a car. You don't grow a building. Concrete and copper wiring and all of that is a commodity. Those are the raw materials that make the world round. So we focus on the companies that extract those particular minerals. Again, if you're going to need more power, we're going to need everything we can. We're going to need nat gas plants. And if people don't want coal, then you're going to need to have nat gas. The power's got to come from somewhere. You're going to need nuclear power. And maybe that's a charged subject. But a lot of these data centers are considering building small nuclear plants and what they call small modular reactors. Well, you're going to need a lot more uranium. So we talk about uranium companies. If you're going to want to diversify into the world that's changing around you, those BRICS nations, they're not buying Facebook and Google. They're backing it with commodities. They're looking at how do we trade oil. Oil is not going away. The world is going to continue to use oil. We may limit our own use and say, oh, well, we're going to do it because of the carbon footprint. They're going to say, great, we'll take all the oil you don't want then and we'll use it. They're going to want the same quality of life that we have. Those people that live in those want to provide for their families too, and they're going to need a lot more copper. They're going to need a lot more uranium for nuclear power. China is building amazing amounts of nuclear energy right now, and that is a huge driver in that space. Lithium for batteries. If you want to plug it in, you can't use a lawnmower anymore that uses gas if you're in California. You can't use a weed whacker. Okay, well, if you want to charge it, you're going to need lithium batteries. Where is that lithium coming from? Where is the cobalt coming from? Where is the nickel coming from? So we look at raw materials as a way to diversify your financial portfolio. You don't want to put all your eggs in that basket. And we cover that in shows, and we talk to executives. We talk to thought leaders. We talk to a lot of economic pundits. We actually talk to some of the guests you have on your show just on economic game theory and how is this all playing in. So come see us at the KE Report. Check out my Substack if you want to talk about the individual mining companies. And I do think it's important to widen your scope to look at where do the products in your life come from. We talked about manufacturing today. Where are they made? But also, how do they get all the parts to make that? Where is that stuff coming from? And how are we going to power it? And we're focused on the resources, the stuff of the world, and energy. How are we going to power all of these needs? And that's really the focus of what we do. And I think there's an investment angle there. I think there's a diversification angle there. And I think there's an opportunity there that's going to be growing over the next couple of years as we start hitting what we call a commodity super cycle. We're already in it, kind of started in 2020. But as that ramp up, real things, hard assets, are going to be in vogue again, maybe more so than right now because we're in a digital world. But people forget all that digital world came from underground, and we dug it out of the ground to make it. And I think that's an opportunity for everybody listening.
All right. Well said. I'm excited about it. I want to check it out more myself. So, Shad, we thank you so much for your time and look forward to having you back on real soon.
Thanks, Todd. It was a pleasure to be here and pleasure speaking with your audience.
Yes, sir. All right, so what do you think? As promised, I'm asking for your comments on this issue. Do you believe that the BRICS nation does have the power collectively to restrict just how much the world depends on the dollar as the world's reserve currency? Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, you can let Shad and I know that you did by hitting that thumbs up. And as always, guys, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please consider doing so now. Hit that alert bell. You'll know every time we upload content just like this. And don't keep information like this all to yourself. Please consider sharing it with your family and friends. The share button is below. See you next time. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.